This week our module is on the topic of animal rights and animal ethics more generally. So we're looking at a pair of articles for and against the idea that animals might have rights, and that the framework of rights is the best way to make sense of our obligations to animals. So the first article is by Tom Regan, making the case for animal rights. And he has a radical vision in this article. He says on page 523, you don't change unjust institutions by tidying them up. And the unjust institutions in question, according to Regan, are those that use animals for human benefit. So that would include things like production of meat and milk, dairy products, as well as use of animals in making human clothing. It would include things like sport, hunting, and fishing. It would include also things like animal testing, whether testing products like cosmetics or also using animals in laboratory experiments. And so Regan has in mind an abolitionist vision. He wants to abolish these unjust institutions, what he takes to be unjust institutions. Now he's arguing that it's not just a matter of appealing to sentimentality. He says it's easy to do that when talking about animals, show pictures of cute bunnies or kittens. Instead, he argues it's not just emotion, but that this idea has reason on its side. And as a philosopher, he's trying to give reasons to change beliefs in order to help bring about a change in these practices. And so he's trying to give reasons, give ideas to change beliefs in order to change these practices. And so he offers 4 different approaches for understanding our relations to animals. The first that he considers is the idea that there's an indirect duty. An indirect duty. And so that holds that we don't have any direct duties to animals, but indirect duties through other human beings. So his example, it's if you kick a dog, for instance, that's not a violation of that animal's rights, but instead it's a violation of our responsibility, our obligations to the human owner of that dog. And so if I kick your dog, the problem isn't that I'm hurting your dog. Instead, the problem is that that dog belongs to you, so I'm kicking your property. Now he recognizes that most people don't think of animals the way they do inanimate objects. And there's a recognition that animals do have pain, but he thinks the indirect duty approach doesn't really make sense of this. He argues that pain is pain wherever it occurs, whether it's in another human being or whether it's in an animal, and that should be the primary consideration in a case like the dog kicking scenario. Now, the second approach that he considers is the contractarian approach. And so for a contractarian, morality is a contract. That's why it has that name. It's a contract that people sign, even if they don't sign it explicitly. There's an implicit contract or a set of rules voluntarily agreed upon by individuals. Now the question that comes up for the contractarian approach is, where does this leave those who can't sign contracts? For instance, the young. Now in that case, the contractarian would say, well, you still need to consider the interests of those who are subject to our actions. So a child deserves our moral consideration because we have obligations and we've formed this contract with their parents or guardians. Okay, so they're still part of the contractual community because they are under the care of parents or guardians who are more directly involved in the contract. And those kids will grow up to be part of it. Now you might ask about those who are handicapped, for instance, and will never be in a position to be fully autonomous. He would say, in that case, you're still dealing with the parents or guardians. What about animals? This is where this is still a kind of indirect duty view. It would be a matter of the owners of those animals who, we consider their interests and we're accountable to them. So if, someone goes to a farm, they aren't accountable to the animals on the farm. They're accountable to the farmers who are raising those animals for their conduct, how they treat the animals there. Now, problem with this approach is that it doesn't really provide representation for all people or all creatures who are affected by the contract. So you have a problem of representation. Not everyone gets to decide on what the rules are going to be. And so that allows the people forming the contract to set it up in a way that serves their interests. And this can create a kind of discrimination. He says on page 525, the result is that this approach to ethics could sanction the most blatant forms of social, economic, moral, and political injustice, because it doesn't allow for the full participation of everyone in framing what the moral rules are going to be. And so this is why he thinks the contractarian approach really isn't adequate for considering the rights of animals. Traditionally, a more promising approach has seemed to be the utilitarian approach. This is one that goes back to Jeremy Bentham, who famously writes, this is one of the sort of founding statements in the history of animal rights philosophy. Bentham writes, "The day may come when the rest of the animal creation may acquire those rights, which never could have been withholden from them but by the hand of tyranny. And the question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer?" So remember, the utilitarian is concerned about pleasure and pain. And this is true not just for human pleasure and pain, but for other creatures. Can they suffer? If they can, then that is something that should be minimized insofar as that's possible. Now, Bentham's successor, John Stuart Mill, writes in Utilitarianism something very similar when he says promoting pleasure and preventing pain should be a concern not only to humanity, but so far as the nature of things admits, to the whole sentient creation. So if an animal is sentient, if it's conscious, if it's able to perceive or feel things, then it should be considered beneficiary of our moral consideration. Probably the most famous philosopher to work on this topic is Peter Singer, who takes a utilitarian approach. And his famous book is Animal Liberation, which was published in 1975. His argument there is against what he calls speciesism, which is akin to sexism or racism. The idea that it's a kind of unjust discrimination against a being, against a creature, because it's a member of the wrong species. That is, that it's not a human being. Okay, so the utilitarian approach might seem like a helpful way to approach this topic because it's recognizing that all pain matters. And also it seems to be a good approach because it's egalitarian in the sense. It considers pain equally among different people. So it's not like some people's pain counts for more than others. And so animal rights advocates would argue the same is true for animals, that we should consider the suffering of animals equally as well. Now, the problem with this approach, according to Regan, is that the utilitarians lack a sense of inherent value or worth. You'll remember when we talked about utilitarianism earlier in the semester, this was a question that came up. So utilitarians tend not to frame things in terms of rights. Okay, that requires a different conception of the person and where moral value comes from. So it belongs more to a Kantian approach. The utilitarian is less concerned about rights and more concerned with outcomes, okay, with the consequences. Remember, it's a consequentialist ethic. And so the danger there, as Regan points out, is that you might be able to justify certain kinds of immoral actions if they bring about moral ends. Okay? The ends would seem to justify the means. So he gives the example of murdering Aunt B if that's going to bring about a greater benefit. And so Regan's concern with animals then is that it seems like we could justify eating animals or experimenting on them because of the benefits that that brings. There's a greater good that comes about because of it. So for this reason, Regan's not satisfied with the utilitarian approach. He thinks it needs to be pushed in the direction of what he calls the rights approach. This is the idea that there is an inherent value that comes with being subject of a life. This is a phrase that he uses on 528, and it's one of Regan's key ideas in other articles that he's written as well. The idea of being an experiencing subject of a life. In the first paragraph on 528, he says, "A conscious creature having an individual welfare that has importance to us, whatever our usefulness to others." So, contrary to the utilitarian view, that being a subject of a life means that certain things matter to us and that we have inherent value regardless of our usefulness to other people. We want and prefer things, believe and feel things, recall and expect things, and all these dimensions of our life, including our pleasure and pain, our enjoyment and suffering, our satisfaction and frustration, our continued existence or our untimely death, all make a difference to the quality of our life as lived, as experienced by us as individuals. As the same is true of those animals that concern us, they too must be viewed as the experiencing subjects of a life with inherent value of their own. Now that's probably counterintuitive for most of us, and Regan wants us to consider, well, why do we think that humans have more value than animals? Now, where does this supposition come from? A common view is that animals lack an immortal soul. Human beings have an immortal soul. And Regan says, this is possible, and he thinks and hopes that maybe that's true, but he thinks we can't really make a philosophical argument on the basis of that because it's too controversial. So some people will say maybe it's the presence of some capacity like reason or autonomy or intellect. But at the same time, he's not convinced that that's enough. The lack of those things, he says, there are human beings, for instance, who don't necessarily exercise those capacities. People who are severely disabled, for instance. Does that mean that their life is less valuable than the life of those who do exercise those to the fullest degree? So some people say, well, it's not the presence of these things, but it's species membership, being members of the species Homo sapiens, that we're human beings. And this is what, following Singer, what Regan calls speciesism, the assumption that some species are more valuable inherently than others. And it's akin to racism or sexism. So he thinks that instead we need to emphasize the equal inherent value of all beings who are subjects of a life. And you can read his argument in more detail. I'm interested to see what you make of his argument in this point. He emphasizes that he's not taking an anti-human position. He's not saying animals are better than humans because they're so innocent or anything like that. He's not making any sentimental arguments. So instead he sees this as working alongside the idea of human rights and working for human rights. But the position he takes is at the same time one of abolition, liberating animals from what he considers unjust institutions. He sees that as a clear application, a clear consequence of the view of animals bearing these inherent rights. So we will talk about that and see what you think about that in class.